Today, we bring you Suicide, the new pathology in Colombia. We are Karen Juliana Suarez, Santiago Castellanos, Juan Diego Basurto, and Gabriela Bendaño. For us, it is important to understand this problem and see how it is affecting Colombia. Lately, we hear many cases of suicide or suicide attempts. Actually, WHO says that every year 700,000 people commit suicide and many others attempt to commit it. In the case of Colombia, the average of suicide cases is approximately 2,000. This is why we decided to make this research, because it is important to understand why people tend to commit this. As a group, we think that the context is one of the main reasons why people can tend to have this type of solutions or action, which is why it led to the following question. How the context of people in Colombia have influenced suicides in the past 5 years. To solve this question, we set the following objectives. For the development, it was fundamental to understand and analyze the following variables: salary, unemployment, and poverty for the economical context, age and location for the environment, gender and level of education, also to see the context of individuals, and finally, the types of pathology such as suicide. On the other hand, we searched for the theory, so we could later on connect it with the statistical work. The principal results we extract from the theory were that young ages like 15 to 25 years old tend to have the highest cases of this pathology, suicide, because of the family problems, the mental health, and the academical pressure. Also, we found that the male population have more cases of suicide than the female population, and that the region with the highest cases was Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and in contrast, the Caribbean region had the lowest number of suicide cases.
For the first analysis, we decided to compare the age and the number of total suicides. Both variables are dependent. This affirms that there is a direct relationship between these variables. Having more age in the population, there is less suicide. However, we notice that we have the top in the range between 15 to 34. It is visible to see that the correlation is not so strong, since deaths by suicide are concentrated in the age group of adolescents and adults. In Colombia, suicide, compared with other cases of death, the most common case of death is homicide. Nevertheless, the median of suicide cases is greater than the one from accidents, meaning that suicide cases are greater. As well, we have that the first quartile of homicide cases is less than the one from suicide, which is important to look up because it means that there are more people killing themselves in the first quartile than the ones that are killed by another human. In the second place, we have compared cities and cases of suicide. We selected the first principal 32 cities in Colombia. We performed an hypothesis testing between cities and suicides, having as a result that both variables are independent. We noticed that there are two particular cases, the city of Bogota and Yopal. These two geographical areas are exceeding 1,000 cases. As well, those cities are the ones with the largest age group of adolescents and adults. Besides, the maximum values shows the same thing that the last comparison, meaning that in the 32 principal cities of Colombia, the accidents are still less than suicides. So it is necessary to analyze a deeper investigation of the environment that citizens come from and how the area of living can influence in committing suicide.
Now, let's look at how the economic context of the country affects suicide cases in major cities. For this, we will analyze three variables: the poverty rate, the unemployment rate, and the average salary for each city. A linear regression was performed for each of these variables to see their influence on suicide rates. In the case of the unemployment rate, it was found that there is an inverse relationship with a correlation of -0.154. However, for this case, the error squared is 0.027, which means that unemployment is only explaining 2% of the suicide rates. Finally, beta 1 with a value of -0.0104 shows that unemployment does not have a significant effect on suicide rates since it's a very low number. For the case of the poverty rate, it is observed that there is an inverse relationship with a correlation of -0.0018. This shows that the relationship between variables is almost null. Likewise, for this case, the error squared is 0.00828, which means that the poverty rate is only explaining 0.82% of suicide rates. Finally, beta 1 with a value of -0.00306 proves that the poverty rates are not significant in explaining suicide. Finally, for the average salary, the results show an inverse relationship with a correlation of -0.013. Likewise, for this case, the error squared is 0.1142, which means that the salary is explaining 11.42% of the suicide rates. Finally, beta 1 with a value of -5.308 shows that this variable is the most significant in explaining suicide rates.
For the second hypothesis test of the educational level, we continue with the same methodology, maintaining that the proportion of suicides is the same in all educational levels. For this, we continue with the rate-tailored confidence level of 1.64 or 95%. With the sample obtained from the database which had a suicides and educational level, we compared the proportions of people in primary education level equal to those of professionals, and we obtained a p-value equals to 0.02 and c equal 1.8, with which we also conclude that hypothesis that suicide is of equal proportion in people with different educational levels is false. This also confirms the theory that people with lower levels of education tend to be more likely to suffer from mental problems and therefore were likely to hypothesis testing to confirm theories that related suicide to other variables such as gender and educational level. For the hypothesis test of the sexes, we did a test based on proportions where the first hypothesis we maintain that men commit suicide in the same proportion as women. For this, we use a confidence level of 95% or 1.64 using a real tail test. We took a sample from the government database that had a suicides and genders. With the test, we obtained a p-value equals 0.01 and c equal 2.1. With which we can conclude that hypothesis test women commit suicide in the same proportion as men is refuted by the values of the test, giving us that men commit suicide in a higher percentage than women, affirming the theoretical part that in the world men have the highest suicide rates because the cultural context have made this sex suffer greater pressures and be more repressed with their feelings.
Conclusion, for the Colombian case, not all the variables impact the same way to the suicide cases. For instance, age is a very important variable to consider because after a certain age, the cases start to decrease, and the highest ones are in teenagers and young adults. Also, it was impressive that the mean of suicides was greater than the accidents, both in age and location. So, it is important to understand what is happening here and how come that the suicides are greater than the accidents. For the case of location, the highest cases are seen in big cities like Bogota, but an important result was Yopal. In 5 years in a row, it was the second city with the highest number of suicides, making us believe that the government should pay more attention to this city. In contrast, the economical context was weak. As the research can exhibit poverty, average salary, and employment does not influence suicide cases. Actually, it is impressive how these variables have a small impact in the suicide rate. As a group, we believe this could happen because the common cases are in ages where most of the population doesn't belong to the labor force. We think that for future research, it could be useful to use qualitative nature variables, such as psychological and social behaviors of the population. Finally, with the hypothesis testing, it was evident that the theory can be proven by the statistics. Thanks to this research, we can not only confirm about the age problem, but also that the male population tends to suicide more than the female population. Also, the level of education has something to do with suicides, because as the results can show, the proportion of primary level education was higher than the professional, meaning that both sex and level of education are variables that highlight the importance of the context in order to attack the problem of suicide cases.